So if you're a guest here, you may not be aware, but we have been working our way through our statement of faith. By the way, if this is too bouncy or too soft or too loud, don't worry, I can't do anything about it. The iPad is not communicating with the sound system, so you've got what you've got, okay? So I'm sorry about that. And if you don't want to listen to me, the door's over there, that's fine. Yeah, you got to stay, mate. Sorry. So we have been working our way through the statement of faith, and we've been looking at the church, but we are taking a break for the next few weeks. We're going to look at Advent and various aspects of Advent. Just so you're aware, on Christmas Day and New Year's Day, they're both on Sundays. The school will not lend us the hall, so you've got 2 Sundays off over Christmas, okay? Just so you're aware. But we are working out, we're just going to look at 2 or 3 things in Advent. Now, the purpose of Advent, as I understand it, is to celebrate the first coming of Jesus and to look forward to his second coming. Okay? That's kind of what I understand Advent to be. And we're going to be looking at just 2 or 3 aspects of Advent over the next 2 or 3 weeks. I'm going to look at one particular one. Now, this morning, I feel quite nervous. And the reason I feel quite nervous is I feel I'm getting in some deep theological water this morning, okay? So I hope it's not going to be too deep for you. You probably understand it all, and you go, why has he not got this? But please bear with me. I've done something rather unusual, and that is I've actually written notes out as opposed to bullet points, so I get it right. We're going to be looking, first of all, at 1 Kings chapter 8. We touched on this a few weeks ago, but Solomon is building his temple. It's the temple that was promised to David, but because of David's sin, he was not allowed to build a temple. And Solomon is building the temple, and he's got it all built, and it's all ready, and it looks fantastic, and people from all around the world are coming to look at it. And then there's the dedication of the temple in 1 Kings 8. And this question that Solomon asks has resonated all through the world since the beginning, and man having to leave the garden, and it'll resonate all the way through to the end. And it's this question that's on the screen. I'm just going to read it for you. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heavens cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his plea. O Lord my God, listen to the cry and to the prayer of that your servant prays before you this day, that your eyes may be open night and day towards this house, the place of which you have said, my name shall be there, that you may listen to the prayer that your servants offer towards this place. And listen to the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray towards this place, and listen in heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive. The question that has resonated, one of the questions that's resonated all through the ages is, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Is it possible for God to dwell on the earth? Now, in the Old Testament, it wasn't even in the concept that was possible. The Old Testament writings just couldn't get their head around it, and they built a temple where God could dwell, but Solomon says even that's too small and too feeble, and how could it be possible that God could dwell in this place? Let's flip over into the New Testament, because we've already had it this morning, but we're going to read it again. We're celebrating the first coming of Jesus and looking towards his second coming. It's very hard to open your Bible when you're one-handed. In John chapter 1, one of the most beautiful poetic understanding of Jesus coming to earth. He gets to verse 14, and John is talking about the Word, and the Word is Jesus. That's what he's driving at. And in verse 14 he says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory as of the Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. We are celebrating a little baby Jesus, okay? And it's possible for us to kind of get all confused about what all that means. And kind of, isn't it sweet? We've got a little baby, we've got grandkids, and when they were born, they're sweet and so lovely and cuddly and smell in certain ways at certain times, sometimes better than others. But we miss, if we're not careful, we miss the significance of Jesus being born on earth. Okay? The Word became flesh, incarnate, meat. He became like you, and he became like me. He was born as a baby. God, the Creator, Jesus, the Word, born as a baby, incarnate. Incarnate. Just think about that for a moment. God, the Son, the Word, becomes a baby and dwells among us. That is one of the most astounding theological truths that you can get your head round. If you get your head round that, boy, does that make a lot of sense when you read the Gospels. He became flesh. This is God the Son who was able to be omnipresent. Okay, omnipresent, everywhere. Becomes flesh in a 12, 13-inch child. 8 ounces or 8 pounds, whatever it is. 8 pounds, isn't it? 8 pounds of human flesh. Get your head round it. It's mind-blowing. And at the same time, John says that he dwelt among us. And the word dwell here is tabernacle. He set up a tent and tabernacled with us. God himself comes and dwells among us. So he's not separate from us anymore. He's dwelling with us. He's living with us on a day-to-day basis. Every single day, every single moment that Jesus is alive, he's dwelling amongst us. It must have been incredible to think about it. If you were just an ordinary peasant in a village, okay? Just think about it. Smelly, mucky, whatever it is your job was. There you are, working at it one day, and this man walks through your village. Okay, God has dwelt among us and become flesh. Suddenly, here I am, doing my thing, and God's there, dwelling among us. Jesus walks through the middle of the village. What must that have been like when he was healing people, touching people, being with people? Awesome. Jesus tabernacled with us. Solomon's question is being answered not in the temple built by stone, but is being answered by the flesh of a man dwelling among us. Can God dwell on the earth? The answer is a resounding absolutely. In a mind-blowing, unexpected way, as a man. And we're going to explore some territory about how Jesus is fully God and fully man. And we're going to start by looking at some heresies. Okay? Heresies are really interesting. People, I don't know about you, but when I talk to people on the streets, friends or whatever about Jesus, I hear some really interesting things about Jesus. Some really interesting things. I go, I never knew that. Oh, did he really have a child and he lived in India? And really? Have you read the Da Vinci Code? It's fascinating. People believe what's more in the book like the Da Vinci Code than there would in the Bible. You can hear some interesting stories about Jesus when you talk to people. But heresy helps us to think about what is wrong and helps us to believe what is right. I had a friend who used to say, thank God for heretics, because they push us towards the truth. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're just going to look at 2 or 3 heresies. Is that all right? You can go home and say to your friends, this morning we had a great time, we looked at some heresies. The mystery of God incarnate and dwelling among us means that men and women have tried to explain the mystery of the incarnation and tabernacling in a way which makes it understandable. And they have not looked at the full wisdom of the Bible, which in the end tells us that this is indeed a mystery. Okay? The answer to the question is it's a mystery. We can't fully explain, we can't fully get our heads around it, we are in danger when we do of getting it wrong. Here's some that people have done. Now, as I'm going through these, I want you to check your theological list just to make sure that you're not sitting in one of these camps. Is that okay? Is that good? You can do this just to understand what it's about. Adoptionism. Adoptionism basically means that Jesus was born as a man, just a little baby. He grew up in Nazareth. He did really well. He was tested by God at various points. And being found to be faithful to God, was adopted by God and given supernatural powers to represent God. Okay, but there was no pre-existence. There's no afterlife for him. He's simply an ambassador on behalf of God. Why is this important? Well, it's important because sometimes we read the God of the Old Testament and think that the Jesus of the New are 2 different beings. And they're not. Adoptionism. You will hear it out there, well, Jesus was just a man. If you ever listen to Jesus Christ Superstar, one of the songs in there, he's just a man. He's just a man. Docetism. Okay, Jesus appeared to have a human body, or he seemed to have a human body, but in fact was God pretending to be human. Okay, so there's no incarnation particularly, there's no cross, and there's no resurrection. Jesus simply kind of puts on the coat of being human and pretends to be human. And you might think, oh, we don't do that. We don't think that way, do we? Well, it creeps into the churches sometimes, where Jesus is simply a super God or superhuman that has no relative understanding of what we're going through. Apollinarianism. It's a bit more tricky, this one. Jesus did have the body of a man, but he only had the mind of God. So he acted like a human, but he only thought like God the Father. That denies his manhood completely. Arianism. God is the only God is the only uncreated being. Therefore, he creates the Son, Jesus, who then creates the world. So Jesus is not part of the Trinity, because there isn't one, and is therefore only an ambassador to the created world. Jesus is created. These are well-meaning Christians who have tried to explain what incarnation actually meant. So Jesus is a created being who is then sent to the earth and represents God. That denies Jesus' essential God nature. And we do that all the time because Jesus couldn't possibly have been a God, could he? If you hear it out there on the streets. How could he possibly be? Nestorianism. Mary gives birth to the human Jesus, not to the God child. And therefore, there are two separate beings in one person. So a kind of spiritual schizophrenia, that Jesus could move between one and the other. I wonder what you do when you read the Gospels and you see what Jesus does. I wonder if sometimes we slip into that, well, Jesus was acting in his human nature there, but in this story, Jesus is acting in his godly nature. We very easily divide the two out in a spiritual schizophrenia, which is nowhere near accurate. And finally, Eutychianism. I said that very quickly because I had to. Jesus is neither divine nor human, but he has this third new nature, which is a blend of both. So he's neither God nor man, he's just some sort of blend. All these heresies have been taught in the church historically in years past and have been corrected through all sorts of statements of faith. Listen, we must understand what it means, as much as we can, that Jesus is fully man and fully God. He is not schizophrenic. He is not adopted. He is not a blend. He is not a created being. He is not an apparition. And he is not God just hiding inside some shell. Jesus was born incarnate, and God dwelt amongst us. You're all looking a little puzzled now. It's like, where are we going with this? Please, somebody just smile and you know you're there. It's okay. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. Jesus is talking about this chapter, the first 3 chapters of Hebrews. Go and read them. They're fantastic. Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the power of his word. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Jesus did not stop being divine when he was born as a child. If that were so, we're told here that the word which upholds everything and by which the creation is made would just stop being. Jesus is born as a child, but is also the God child. John 1 verse 1 puts it this way: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, so he's not a created being. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him is life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. We sometimes sing a song which goes back to the 80s. If you've been around for a long time, you'll know this song. It says, "You laid aside your majesty, gave up everything for me, suffered at the hands of those you had created." Okay, and I love that song. But we must be careful that we don't edge from that into that Jesus stopped being fully God when he laid aside his majesty. We must not go there. Yes, he lays aside aspects, so he's not omnipresent anymore. He's living and breathing among us as Jesus. But he did not lay aside his Godhead. I and the Father are one, says Jesus. How many times in John's Gospel, I am the Father of one. If you want to see what God the Father looks like, look at me. All the way through John's Gospel, John is proclaiming Jesus is the divine being and his human being. In focusing on one and not the other, we lose the truth of God dwelling among us. So what does all that mean? Well, Jesus is as human as we are. The Gospels depict him as being tired with emotions, and he's hungry. He gets disappointed with his disciples. He has compassion with people. He feels grief. He sleeps, he eats, he bleeds. He's got sympathy and empathy. He feels lonely, has joy and enjoyment in other people around him. Jesus was as human as I am, which means that he's able to identify with everything that I'm going through. Everything. There is not one element of my humanity that Jesus does not understand. Nothing. In fact, when I read the Gospels, I start to understand that Jesus understood a lot more about being human than I did. It means he's able to identify, not just identify, but understand and empathize with everything that I feel. When I get angry, when I get tired and I want to give up. When somebody asks me to do something and I really don't want to do it, Jesus understands. He's been there. Oh God, not my will, but yours be done. Everything. The ups, the downs, the crises and the problems, exhaustion, pain, abandonment. He understands because he's been there. What an amazing gospel we have. What amazing that God himself would understand what it means to be human. I'm looking at Roger because we had a long debate this week about what I should preach about, and I'm just hoping I'm still on track. There's a pit outside, there's some stones ready. You're welcome to do that if necessary. In Hebrews 2 verse 9 it says this: he was crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. The ultimate pain of being a human, of dying. All those other heresies, in the end, if you're not careful, Jesus' death is not, it's an act, or it's some sort of, sorry, am I missing something? It's an act. It's some sort of pretend thing that happens, or suddenly Jesus dying isn't God on a cross dying for me. Secondly, Jesus is tempted in every way just like we are. Let's look at Hebrews 4. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we might receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. Jesus is our high priest who's been tempted in every single way that we have. And I'm going to say the same thing again now. When you read the Gospels, actually Jesus is tempted beyond where we are. so that he might understand what temptation means for me. This is where we're getting some deep water. Because if Jesus is fully God, and here we are discussing this, and even discussing it opens up the possibility of misunderstanding. And the question that I got to when I was preparing this was, well, was it possible for Jesus to sin then? If he's fully divine, then it's not possible. If he's fully man, then it must be possible. And if it's not possible, how could he be tempted like I am? And so I've been struggling with this, and Roger and I have been debating this, and I just want to read something in a moment. Yeah, I'm going to read it now. This is an article by John Piper, who I respect greatly in desiring God. And he asked this question: was it possible for Jesus to sin? Well, it depends on how you define possible. If by possible you mean, did he have the brain and natural capacities to discern a temptation and choose it, then yes. He had a brain, he had a will. If he didn't, he would not be a human being. He's discerning, he's thinking, he's feeling, he knows these things. He's human. If he didn't have these, then he would be less than or greater than human. But historically, the word possible has another meaning, a very important meaning, namely a moral ability. There's a natural ability which he must have in order to be accountable and human, and a moral ability which he does not have. A moral ability is when you're bad enough to choose to sin. There's so much badness in you as we are born in sin that you can choose. Jesus didn't have it. There's no badness in him. Therefore, he did not ever, in his willing and feeling and in his perception of temptation, ever rise to the point of getting there. Because that's evil in us. Evil is not just acting, evil is wanting to act in a certain way. Craving money is as bad as having money that you stole. I want the praise of man, I want that money, I want that lustful object. These things are evil. Jesus never had any of these because he was perfect. And if you don't have those, you can't do it. You can't choose to sin if there's no desire to sin. And Jesus never desired to sin. Therefore, he couldn't. And so in these two ways, it was possible and it wasn't possible for Jesus to sin. Why is that important? It's important because I need to understand that Jesus really could understand what it was like to be tempted like I am. He wasn't superhuman. He wasn't a kind of God who kind of pretended to deal with temptation. Let's look at Luke 4. In Luke 4, the temptation of Jesus happens directly after he's filled with the Holy Spirit. And he's tempted to, first of all, use his spiritual gifts to miraculously change stones to bread. His temptation, because Satan understood that he was both man and God, Jesus is hungry at this point. He's been fasting for 40 days, so he's pretty hungry. And Satan comes along and tempts him with his godly nature and says, well, you could turn that stone into bread. Why don't you do that? Why not bypass the provision that God has given you and do it yourself? Why not become like him? And that's a bigger temptation than I've ever been through. His second one was to usurp the authority of God and thus worship somebody who was other than God. Well, if you bow down, I'll give you all these things. If you worship me, you could have all these things. That would have short-circuited the cross, wouldn't it? That would have dealt with it nicely. And the third temptation, to test God's promise in unreasonable ways. Well, if you throw yourself off this cliff, by the time you get to the bottom, the angels will have come and rescued you. It's unreasonable. These three temptations that Jesus goes through are there to show us that he understands temptation beyond anything that we've ever felt ourselves. And he came out the other side triumphant. He was able to resist everything. And how did he do that? And what lessons can we learn? He was filled with the Spirit. Well, there's one. If I want to resist temptation and be like Jesus, why not get filled with the Spirit? Secondly, he knew what the Bible actually said, not what Satan said it said. Thirdly, he's able to discern what is temptation, and he deals with it by totally trusting, worshipping, and obeying God the Father. Physical needs and wants are really important, says Tom Wright, but not as important as loyalty to God. Jesus' status, he writes, as God's Son commits him not to show prestige, but there's the strange path of humility, service, and death. At the heart of our resistance to temptation is love and loyalty to God, who's already called us in his beloved children in Christ. In other words, Jesus, he's tempted every single way. Now, as a rhetorical question, you don't need to put your hands up, who's been tempted already this morning? Okay. And and the second question that comes behind that is, who gave in? We are tempted every single day in so many different ways. In actual fact, most of the time we don't even realize it's there. But Jesus understands my temptation. He knows because he's been there. He knows what it's like. It must have, some of the things he went through, and I think that's just like me. I'm tempted to bypass God's provision. I'm tempted to be unreasonable with God. I'm tempted to worship other things. My problem is, I give in. But Jesus didn't. He endures temptation to come out the other side perfect before God. Let's look at Romans 8. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Who will bring any charge against God's elect? It's God who justifies. Who is to condemn? Christ Jesus is the one who died, more than that, was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who is indeed interceding for us. My final point is this: Jesus, the human, is interceding for us before the Father. That's what that scripture says, and it's true. Jesus Christ dies, he's raised from the dead, he's ascended into heaven, and right now, today, this very second, he's interceding on your behalf before the Father. Because he understands what it's like to be human, because he's been tempted, he represents us faithfully to God the Father, interceding for you, pleading on your behalf. Oh, Father, there's Chris. He's human. He's one of mine. I'm interceding. God be with him. God give him peace. God give him strength. God, don't judge him for his sin. Here's my grace. Here's my mercy. Here's my death on the cross for Chris, representing him faithfully, moment by moment. And it's not just Chris. It's all of us. Intervening, that's what interceding means. It means intervening between two parties who are having a problem with a view to reconciling their differences. Boy, does Jesus do that in front of the Father. I've got a problem with the Father. It's called sin. And he intervenes on my behalf, moment by moment, now. He represents my humanity in all its fullness, but without sin. To a holy God who accepts his sacrifice because of his sinful life. So, how does this point us to the second coming of Jesus? Jesus the man will return as Jesus the man, but in all his Godhead displayed before us. King of kings, Lord of lords, written on his thigh, Revelation 19. He comes back as the warrior king. I saw no temple, it says in Revelation 21, the dwelling place of God. There you go. I saw no temple in the city, for its temple, the dwelling place, is the Lord Almighty and the Lamb, who is Jesus. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives its light, and its lamp is the Lamb. When we see him, we will suddenly understand just how human he was. And we will see him in all his glory as a man with nail prints in his hands, seated at the right hand of the Father, because God the Father sent his Son, God the Son, to dwell among us. And we will have no need for anything else because the Lamb himself will be our dwelling place. God became flesh and dwelt among us. And we will worship him forever and forever and forever because he is full of grace and truth. Please forgive my stumblings around. Please forgive I feel like I've been swimming in a very, very deep swimming pool today. But what I got from this personally is this. God, the awesome miracle of Jesus, the Son, dwelling among us as a baby, becoming just like me, so that he can represent me before the Father. That is our hope. Chris.
Light of the world, you step down into darkness. Open my eyes, let me see beauty that made this heart adore you. Hope of a life spent with you. So here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. Sing verse 1 again. Light of the world, you step down into darkness. Open my eyes, set me free. Beauty that made this heart adore you. Hope of a life spent with you. So here I am to worship. Here I am to bow down. Here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether